The horn of the White Hand had gone silent, and the woods of Amon Hen smelled of blood, split pine, and failure. Mur spat a glob of black bile into the mud. He gripped the shaft of his heavy scimitar until his leather gauntlets creaked. Up the ridge, the big one, Lurtz, was dead. Mur had seen it. He had seen the long-haired man-thing with the steel sword take Lurtz's head, and he had seen the rest of the fighting Uruks break like sheep.
"Keep moving. Move or I'll skin the lot of you."
That was Ugluk's voice. Ugluk was still shouting, still trying to keep the rabble together. The smaller, wire-limbed northern orcs from the mountains were already whimpering, casting fearful glances back at the trees where the great man-archer was still picking them off from the shadows. On the shoulders of the Uruks ahead of him rested heavy canvas sacks. Mur could hear the halflings thrashing and cursing in high, squeaky voices. Mur was built for the sun, bred by the wizard to run for days without sleep, but he felt a heavy, cold iron weight settling deep in his chest. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was the realization that Lurtz, the strongest, meanest, most perfect specimen Saruman had pulled from the mud, was rotting on a riverbank because of 3 lone men. The White Hand, Mur thought, looking down at the pale symbol painted on his own leather breastplate. The wizard promised us the world. He said the age of men was over. A chorus of shrieks erupted from the line ahead. Ugluk was beating a sniveling Mordor orc with the flat of his blade. "They smell like horse flesh," the small orc shrieked, pointing toward the wide, rolling plains of Rohan that stretched out before them. "The horse boys are coming. We should head for the forest."
"We head for the river," Ugluk roared, backhanding the creature. "We have the halflings. Saruman wants them alive and unspoiled." "Saruman wants," Mur thought.
Always what the wizard wanted, what the eye wanted, what the whip demanded. Mur looked at the endless open grass of Rohan. To run that way was to invite the spears of the horsemen. To stay with Ugluk was to march straight into a meat grinder, chased by the grey-eyed tracker who didn't know how to stop. The horde surged past him, a river of dark iron, leather, and heavy breathing. No one noticed the large Uruk stepping sideways behind a massive, moss-covered boulder. No one looked back. They were too busy smelling the air for horse sweat and looking for the next whip crack from Ugluk. Mur knelt in the damp dirt behind the stone. He reached up to his chest, dug his thick, clawed fingers under the edge of his leather armor, and pulled. With a violent, screaming tear of iron rivets, he ripped the White Hand insignia clean off his breastplate and threw it into the mud. He looked out at the rolling plains, his yellow eyes narrowing. He was free. But he was also a monster, alone in a world that hated his kind. For months, the plains of Rohan felt like a massive open-air prison. To the Rohirrim, a lone traveler on foot was a rarity. To an Uruk-hai, stepping into the golden sunlight was an active invitation to a horseman's spear. Mur learned to survive by becoming a shadow. He had stolen a heavy, mud-stained traveling robe from a ruined homestead near the Entwash River. Pulling the deep hood low, it masked his flat nose, his jutting lower tusks, and his glowing yellow eyes. Beneath the heavy wool, strapped to his back, he carried a long, notched steel blade, a Rohirrim longsword he had pulled from a dead rider's scabbard. It was lighter than the brutal Isengard scimitars, balanced for the reach of a man. But it was steel, and it kept the remaining wild mountain orcs from testing him in the dark. He moved mostly at twilight, avoiding the great roads and the burning villages where Saruman's raiding parties still roamed. Then, on the edge of the Eastamnet, where the grasslands began to swell into rocky foothills, he found it. A small, isolated farmstead tucked into a ravine. The main house had been burned to a black skeleton by a pack of Snaga orcs weeks before. The human family who owned it was long gone, either dead or fled south to the safety of the mountain holds. But the well still held clean water. The stone barn still had a roof, and the high, rocky ridges of the ravine blocked the farm from the sight of passing scouts. For the first time in his manufactured life, Mur did not follow an order. Instead of burning the rest of it down, he went to work. The soil. With his massive clawed hands, he cleared the charred debris and began tilling a patch of workable earth. The upkeep. He repaired the broken fences with split timber, building a secure perimeter that didn't require a constant sentry. The hunt. In the dark, he stalked the ravine for mountain goats and wild hares, bringing them back to smoke the meat over a low, smokeless peat fire. He lived in the stone barn. He slept on a bed of dry straw rather than the wet mud of the breeding pits. There was no iron collar around his neck and no drums echoing in the deep. But Mur was no fool. He was a monster living in a land of men, and his peace was built on a razor's edge. He kept his stolen Rohirrim sword sharpened and resting against the barn door every night. One chilly autumn morning, while Mur was hauling a heavy bucket of water from the well, his pointed ears twitched. The wind had shifted, and with it came a sound that made the coarse hair on the back of his neck stand straight up, the rhythmic, heavy thudding of galloping horses. And they were heading straight for his ravine. The autumn evening was quiet until the screaming started. Mur was in his stone barn preparing his dinner over a low peat fire. He had a fat wild hare roasting on a spit, its rich fat dripping into the coals. For a fleeting moment, the quiet felt like peace. Then, a small, desperate figure burst through the high brush at the edge of his ravine. It was a human child, a boy no older than 10, his tunic torn and his face streaked with soot and tears. He was stumbling, sobbing for breath, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. Right behind him, crashing through the undergrowth like a rabid beast, came his pursuer. It was a wild man of Dunland. The raider was tall and broad, his long, unkempt hair matted with grease. He wore rough animal skins over his chest and carried a heavy, notched battle-axe. On his face was a cruel, hungry grin. He and his pack had spent the evening sacking and burning the child's village, and he had chased this little scrap of prey into the hills purely for sport. The boy didn't see the dark opening of the barn until he was right on top of it. He scrambled inside, looking for any place to hide, and ran straight into the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of Mur. The child froze. He looked up at the massive hooded figure, let out a choked shriek of despair, and collapsed to his knees in the straw. To the boy, he had just run from a murderer straight into the arms of a monster. Mur looked down at the shaking child. He smelled the smoke of a burning village clinging to the boy's clothes. He remembered the burning villages he had marched past under Saruman's banners. He remembered the screaming.
"Get in the back," Mur growled, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "Under the straw. Do not make a sound."
The boy was too terrified to argue. He scrambled into the dark corner of the barn and buried himself beneath a heavy pile of dry livestock straw. The heavy, thudding footsteps of the wild man reached the barn door. The Dunlending stepped into the firelight, panting and grinning, raising his axe.
"I know you're in here, little pig," the wild man laughed in broken Westron. "Come out and I'll make it quick."
Then the wild man stopped. His eyes adjusted to the firelight, moving away from the empty floor to the massive, robed figure standing by the spit. Mur did not speak. Slowly, deliberately, The Uruk reached behind his back and drew his stolen Rohirrim longsword. The steel sang as it left the scabbard, catching the orange glow of the fire. The wild man's grin vanished. He looked at the size of the warrior beneath the heavy cloak and tightened his grip on his axe.
"This is not your fight, traveller!" the Dunlending hissed, stepping into a combat stance. "That boy is my prize! Step aside, or you'll burn with the rest of this valley!"
Mur adjusted his grip on the long sword, his yellow eyes flashing like twin embers beneath the shadow of his deep hood.
"I am done taking orders from wild men," Mur grunted, "and I am done letting children burn."
The wild man didn't wait. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, swinging his heavy battle-axe in a vicious, horizontal arc aimed straight for Mur's midsection. Mur did not dodge. He stepped into the blow. He brought the stolen Rohirrim longsword down hard, catching the shaft of the axe just below the iron head. The force of the collision rang through the stone barn like a blacksmith's hammer. Any normal man's arms would have gone numb from the shock, but Mur possessed the unnatural, engineered strength of the Uruk-hai. He didn't even flinch. With a powerful twist of his wrists, Mur shoved the axe violently to the side, throwing the wild man off balance. The Dunlending stumbled, his eyes widening in shock. He had expected a frightened traveller, not a stone wall of muscle. Mur pressed his advantage. He stepped forward and delivered a brutal front kick with his heavy, iron-toed boot directly into the wild man's chest. The blow landed with a sickening crunch of ribs. The raider was launched backward through the air, crashing through the wooden barn door and landing hard in the dirt outside. Mur didn't let up. He stalked out of the barn into the cool night air, his long sword held low at his side. The wild man rolled onto his stomach, coughing up blood, but his malice kept him moving. He scrambled to his feet, wildly swinging his axe in desperate, wide slashes to keep Mur back.
"What are you?" the raider spat, wiping blood from his beard.
Mur didn't answer. He moved with a terrifying, predator-like silence. The wild man took a heavy overhead swing, putting all his remaining weight into the blow. Mur sidestepped the attack with surprising speed for his size. The axe blade buried itself deep into the soft earth where Mur had been standing a split second before. Before the wild man could yank the weapon free, Mur brought his heavy boot down onto the axe shaft, snapping the wood like a dry twig. Terrified and weaponless, the wild man looked up. In that moment, the hood of Mur's travelling cloak fell back. The twin, glowing yellow eyes, the flat snout, and the jagged, protruding lower tusks of the Uruk-hai were revealed in the pale moonlight. The wild man's face went completely white. He didn't even scream. The terror locked his throat tight. He scrambled backward on his hands and heels, trying to get away from the monster. Mur raised the Rohirrim longsword high above his head, the steel gleaming in the dark.
"For the white hand,"
Mur growled, his voice a low, gravelly snarl.
"and for the whips."
He brought the blade down. The strike was clean, swift, and lethal. The wild man's body went limp in the grass. His reign of terror over the valley ended in a single, decisive stroke. Mur stood over the fallen raider for a long moment, his chest heaving as the adrenaline cooled. He didn't feel the thrill of battle that Saruman had bred into him. He just felt a grim, quiet satisfaction. He wiped the blood from his stolen blade on the wild man's furs and sheathed it. Then he turned back toward the barn to check on the hidden child. Mur stepped back into the barn, the smell of blood and wet earth clinging to his heavy wool cloak. The straw in the corner shifted. A pair of wide, terrified eyes peeked out. The boy was trembling so violently, the dry stalks of straw rattled around him. He looked at Mur's exposed face, the dark, leather-like skin, the flat snout, and the sharp tusks.
Do not be frightened, boy,
Mur grunted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He consciously kept his distance, staying by the dying fire.
I will not hurt you.
The child swallowed hard, his voice small and shaking.
But you're one of them, aren't you? The things that burned my home.
Mur looked down at his own thick, clawed hands. He felt the phantom weight of the armor he used to wear.
I am,
Mur said simply. He didn't lie.
but I am not one of them. At least, not anymore.
The boy stared at him. He looked at the Uruk's yellow eyes, then down at the dead wild man outside the door, and then back to the giant monster offering him shelter. The sheer impossibility of it seemed to stun the child into silence.
You may rest here tonight,
Mur continued, gesturing toward the warm fire and the roasting meat.
No more wild men will come tonight. In the morning I shall take you to a village of Rohan. You'll be safe there.
The boy didn't move for a long time. Then, driven by exhaustion and the freezing autumn night air, he slowly crawled out from under the straw. He sat by the fire, keeping as far away from the massive Uruk as the small barn allowed. Mur sat on a wooden stump across from him, pulled his deep hood back over his face, and went back to tending his dinner in silence.